nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I have a couple of things I want to say before we get started, and one is we have a very full agenda this evening, and we have concerns. Our city clerk staff has concerns about the life expectancy of our microphones, so we may have to change those out or change the batteries out during the meeting, just so that everyone knows, so that we make sure we're being recorded. The other thing that I wanted just to explain to council is, I know the online version of our meeting went out Friday afternoon, but the print version, for those of us, Councilman Rose Pepe and I, and you, we didn't receive ours till Monday. And that is because Finance Director Crocker and I were still working on the agenda and the packet after the staff had left that day. We were waiting for information back from our land use attorney, and we wanted to make sure that we did things correctly, and so we failed to meet the deadline. So our apologies, but I believe everyone had access online to the information, and then we were able to pick up our printed material, those of us who use the printed material, first thing Monday morning. So we apologize for that, but it just took us a while to get through the work we needed to do. So we will start our agenda items with, it says Chimes and Light event in Marquee. I think maybe that's a little misnamed, and I would like also to just give a little introduction to this before I turn it over to our finance director. This was also one of the reasons that we were a little late in getting the packet out, in that I'm in Mayor Pro Tem. I was in Seattle all day Thursday at 2 PSRC meetings, and then I had to be in Squim on Friday morning for an RPTO meeting, and I didn't get back from Squim until about 3 o'clock. So that was the first that Noah and I were able to get together and talk about 2 or 3 different items on the agenda. One of which was the electrical issue on our Marquee. And so this first agenda item, I just want to give a little background, is after Noah explained to me the conditions, and Tony Lang was there, explained to me the conditions, the electrical situation, and the safety concerns. Noah and I made the decision to cut the power to those electrical outlets Friday afternoon. And we notified the Port Orchard Bay Street Association because they had hung lights, and all of a sudden we were cutting the power to their lights. And we knew that there would be people decorating the Christmas trees over the weekend. And we did not want to have a safety situation, so we cut the power. We let everyone know that we would be having a meeting, this meeting, and that would be one of our agenda items. So when we look at the title of that first agenda item, I would change the agenda. This is what the discussion this evening is the electrical circuits on our Marquee. This is not a discussion about the Bay Street, Port Orchard Bay Street Association. It doesn't really have anything to do with them, other than when they put up their holiday lights and plugged them in, we found out that we had an electrical issue. And so that's where we picked this up. And so I will turn it over to Noah.
Great. Thank you. Good evening. The Mayor Pro Tem did a great job kind of talking through the issue as it came to us. So again, I've also asked Tony Lang here, who's the Public Works Operations Manager, to speak to the technical issues on the electrical side and to answer some of the solutions that we've kind of come up with since then. So the summary and backstory is that, as I understand it, a concerned citizen inquired about the icicle lights not working on a certain section of the Marquee. Additionally, the fire marshal was contacted regarding extension cords that were wrapping around poles and down towards the potted tree plants. When both the city official and fire marshal showed up and reviewed everything, they found some issues with the electrical system. So upon investigation, both the city electrician, fire marshal identified violations that need to be corrected immediately. Again, this was about public safety. So they came and met with us. And as you know, once an issue is known by a city official, it becomes a liability and risk of the city. Therefore, city staff has to take action. And so with the support of the Mayor Pro Tem, again, we took action before the weekend to eliminate the immediate electrical concerns, knowing we could come back here Tuesday and regroup with you all to talk about immediate solutions, short-term solutions, and then the longer-term plan to address the Marquee and potential electrical concerns. I want to give Mr. Lang a chance, I know he's hiding over there, to discuss briefly some of the fire code issues as well as electrical issues. So Tony, would you mind coming up over here, or do you want to speak from there?
It's up to you guys. Okay.
We've got a seat warmed up for you.
Just by an outlet.
Thank you.
Do you want to scoot over?
Yep.
Good idea. Thank you. Okay, so upon inspection, not only by the fire marshal, but our city electrician, the icicle lights need to be plugged directly into a receptacle. There's certain ones out there that are plugged into three-way splitters. They're daisy chaining extension cords together, which isn't legal, or from a fire code perspective or a building code perspective. All the extension cords need to be outdoor rated and plugged directly into a receptacle or a surge protector. The cords can be attached using zip ties, but using staples is not allowed. All extension cords need to be single-use only, not daisy chained. All three-way splitters need to be removed. Surge protectors with multiple plugs can be used to supply more outlets. Extension cords cannot be tightly wound or coiled around posts. And the holiday or the temporary lighting can only be in use for 90 days maximum. Those were all the fire code violations that he noticed. The building code, upon inspection by our electrician, the receptacles that are supplied by an SO cord cannot be used. I believe the SO cord was installed originally for the garland, to supply the receptacles for the garland when they started stringing that across the road.
What is an SO cord?
It's just a temporary black thick cord, sort of like you would see at a fair that they run to the machines. All the receptacles that are not functioning need to be replaced with a GFI plug, as well as all the receptacles on that particular circuit. Holiday lighting needs to be protected by GFI receptacles. The Marquee has none of these type of receptacles. So that's what we found. And then moving forward, obviously I talked to Noah how we wanted to proceed.
Yeah, so what we were hoping to get from council tonight is direction on how you guys would like to proceed to handle the electrical issue. Again, we took immediate action to stop it. We have some solutions, ideas, as the council so desires how we can carry this forward. Again, we recognize that the tree event is part of the Chimes and Lights is impacted by this, so that's important to mention here. So with that, we've taken a couple steps to correct the GFI issues. We talked to our electrician, and he has a strategy to address some of the receptacle, or speak at any time, Tony, on the technical side. That's why you're here.
He's recommended that we replace the GFI breakers instead of the receptacles. Instead of doing 20 receptacles, of which the boxes at this point aren't deep enough for a GFI receptacle, he can do a GFI breaker. It just doesn't tell you where the problem is. If you have a problem way down at the end of the line, it's not going to tell you individually where it's at. It's to get by. It's a Band-Aid at this point, just to get, so we can have working receptacles.
You'd have to test each receptacle then if it trips.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. If you did individual receptacles, then it would tell you where the fault is.
This is just, we're looking at an interim solution to get through
Yes,
this year, and then we can deal with the larger issue. You know, downtown lighting, Marquee, a much larger conversation for next year.
yeah,
So this is the Band-Aid.
yeah.
What do you need from us to fix the problem?
Well, I think generally all we're looking for is council support if you want us to move forward and address the issues of the lighting on the marquee and the trees in the most cost-efficient manner we can. And we would rely upon the chimes and lights budget in order to pay for the cost to do that.
And I think, well, and I think there's two main, when I was talking to Noah earlier, there are like two main avenues, and correct me if I'm wrong. One avenue is we just plug everything in like we did last year and hope that nothing happens, and just knowing that we have a liability and we're gonna assume that risk.
Well, and I say that's not an avenue. That's
That's
not an avenue. That's
No,
not an avenue.
no, I'm just saying, I mean,
That's the do-nothing approach.
that's the do nothing and, you know, see no evil, speak no evil, and we just plug everything in trees
Except
and.
we know now.
Yeah.
But we know,
There's a
right,
problem.
I'm
It's
saying,
not
so
an
there's,
option. So what's next?
well, I'm just saying, the full menu, I mean, there's, some people may go down that road.
Okay, we're not.
The other one is, we look at what we can do this year, and that may limit ourselves to only being able to address the icicle lights, and that the trees may have to be done separately, either through individual businesses or battery-powered lights for the trees. I mean, that's like a very quick summary.
So in that second scenario, are you talking about with the GFI circuit replacement, you could still only use LED?
So I think, again, I'm gonna keep pointing to Tony as the expert here. I think with the GFI,
From an electrical standpoint for a building code, yes, the GFIs were compliant if we replace with the GFI breakers. Knowing that they're incandescent bulbs, there's manufacturer's specifications that you can't plug so many in a chain without popping the breaker or exceeding their recommendations. From what I hear, on the incandescents, you can only plug 3 17-footers in a row. There's not enough receptacles per block to actually do that without more receptacles. We might be able to make it work, but to add the holiday trees into it, you're just adding on the load and you're exceeding the recommendations.
So that's per receptacle or altogether?
Well, I believe there's 5 receptacles on each block on each side of the street.
So 3 per block.
So
Yeah.
what's the difference cost-wise of replacing the receptacles rather than just the breaker?
Not really, there's not really
Does that
a
buy us
difference.
anything?
No,
Okay.
no.
And we don't have time to change all the boxes.
It's just saving us time as far as our electrician being tied to it for a few days, yeah.
so one of the solutions that Tony and our electrician brought forward is the GFI breaker, and then adding receptacles along the path to break up the string, as I'm understanding this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that would allow us then to let the lights that are there be used. So our major concern was first, these lights are gonna overheat and burn, we have to pull them down and use LEDs. Tony and the staff come up with a solution to use those lights that are in place, but we would have to go forward and add receptacles. That's great, that gives us the solution of being able to use the lights that are there. It'll take some time and resources from the city's part to do that. What we don't get to in that solution is the trees. And so this is where, again, Tony and I have been talking, we have 2 kind of issues here. One is the lighting along the marquee.
The icicle lights.
The icicle lighting, and the other is the trees. We have a solution we think is low cost, can get us through the lighting on the marquee. The better solution would be going to all LED lights on the marquee, and then using that to tap into like the Christmas trees. The problem that Tony and I are concerned about with that option is if we can actually get to a supplier of enough LED lights to do the whole, both sides at this point in time. So we can't,
LED icicle.
yes.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So are we concerned about the electrical load, like the amount of electricity needed? And if we had to pick one, would you say we pick the marquee versus the trees? Is that kind of what you're?
Well, the marquee icicle lights are there's 1,300 total feet of icicle lights. That's gonna put more of a load on it than the 60 trees.
So if we did one or the other, do we have enough capacity?
If you did the incandescents, you would not be able to do the trees. I wouldn't feel comfortable plugging.
What I'm thinking is, what if we listed the trees?
Okay, so the trees are LEDs. We required all the lighting on the trees to be LEDs.
Okay.
So you can go back, and that's a whole different scenario then. The only incandescents are the icicle lights.
Yep.
What we need to find out is how many of those we could possibly keep up and how many we would need to replace using the new GFIs and what kind of load that would be. Maybe we wouldn't need to replace all of the icicle lights because you know there are some places where there aren't as many trees. Given by Myries, there's quite a gap over there. Okay, so can we work this out that we find out what we would need to replace in the way of icicle lights with LEDs that would make us compliant? The trees are fine.
Do we know that the trees
Just
are
a
fine?
second, I have another question.
They're all LEDs. That was our requirement.
Okay,
But-
if we add additional receptacles and change out the breakers and use LED lights, LED icicle lights, can we also power the trees?
Yes.
So we have a solution that will encompass everything. Okay. Sean?
No, that's exactly my question, and a follow-up to that is that here we have 1,700 feet of these things.
1,300 feet of icicle lights, yeah.
So they're about 20, how,
The largest, or the longest run is 25 feet.
so we're roughly looking at 65 strands. I can't imagine these aren't available.
I was just looked on Amazon.
It's just- Yeah, I mean,
It's the
It
cost.
just depends on how many, they sell them in 17-foot lengths, 25-foot lengths. The smaller lengths you get, the more it's gonna be.
And see, Pops had just invested about nearly $1,000 purchasing those lights because they buy them new every year.
Correct, but as I said earlier, POPSA and has had an informal, I don't even know if it's been an arrangement with the city, but they've been putting these lights up for the last 15 to 18 years. And the city has known about it, and they've used the same kind of lights. We, in the past, tried to salvage those icicle lights. It didn't work. One year, we put up LED lights down there. They weren't icicle lights. That wasn't pleasing to everyone, so they went back to the icicle lights. So they're buying those new every year.
Yeah.
POBSA has done nothing different than they ever have in the past. So what we have is an electrical issue now. And if we need to solve the electrical issue, I do not think we go back to POPSA and say you have to replace your
No,
lights. I think we have to replace
right.
the lights. And if we can do it all with LED lights at a reasonable price, and we can also get the Christmas trees lit, then I think that would be a reasonable solution.
The thing is, can we get that quantity?
It's trying to find the right supplier that has,
Amazon, we have to order tomorrow. There's 32-foot strands at $39 a piece. Would be 40 strands. That's nothing.
John?
Do we have enough power in the breaker panel that we could add more circuits to this? I mean, if we're gonna put in additional receptacles, can we put in an additional GFI circuit then?
well, the additional receptacles are gonna be through a surge protector, so, you know, like you have a household surge protector, so you add an additional 6 in that one plug-in, yeah.
So is it possible to add another circuit, run it down the line?
Between now and December 7th, probably not.
All right.
So it's just a time constraint at a last minute.
Yeah, I think it's
sort of
important to
project.
remember that, you know, we only have one electrician in the city who's also working on our pumps and our wells, dedicated. So we're trying to manage, you know, the critical infrastructure of the city that has to keep running with this new issue that just developed within the last
Yeah.
week. So we're trying to be mindful of his time.
The other thing is that it is our Chimes and Lights Festival. It is the holiday season, and we want downtown to be festive. This is no one's fault. It's just, we weren't.
We have to fix it.
We have to fix it, and we didn't know that we had an electrical issue, or we could have done it in July, you know, but we didn't know that.
So in the information you guys provided, you put a range of $3,000 to $4,000. Is that gonna fix it? Including LED icicle lights
Yeah, it's just finding a supplier that can supply that quantity, because you don't want to have different look all the way down the Marquee,
That was
so.
why I was,
Well,
I had already tried to
is it
order
warm? Is it warm, visible LEDs?
almost 30 boxes, and they canceled my order because they couldn't meet the quantity, so,
you could also try Scott McLennan's.
okay.
So I think what staff was hoping to get tonight was, inform the council kind of the issue, because it is impacting our downtown, and it does impact the festival. We want to kind of gauge your support, whether you want us to go through and spend, and I would throw a larger number out there, up to $10,000 to fix this electrical issue, lights and the whole thing. We're of course going to try to minimize that to 3, 4, whatever we can do to be most creative to address the issue. But I guess we're looking for that direction from council, yes, you're supportive or not. And if not, we will take the minimal action to get into, for public safety.
Scott had a caution.
Well, no, I guess I was just gonna observe that it sounds like the solution is to go ahead and order lights and put in an additional breaker, and then it's all good.
Yeah,
for
the
now.
preferred method would be
I
to
think it's the
upgrade to
preferred and more
LED.
expensive, but we're just concerned whether we can actually get the LED lights.
Yeah,
And then if it doesn't happen, then we have to kind of come up with a backup plan for the trees. So what we don't have for the trees, a plan for is the power source to the trees.
The trees need to be lit. This is a contest. We have involvement of
Mhm.
58 organizations, individuals. The trees need to be lit. And I believe that we can have both. You know, it's just a matter of, it's a very short period of time. So can we get those receptacles taken care
My
of?
last question would be, do we have time to hang the lights?
we'll have to make it.
Well, that's the things we gotta have staff to take down the current lights, put up the new lights, do the receptacles, so it's gonna be 2 to 3 people, you know, a good couple of days, and again, I know that Mike was scheduled to work on some other pump station type stuff, so, you know, all we can do is try to pull some people and dedicate to it, but we wanted to make sure that we got support to go down this interim measure, and we weren't sure, when we talked earlier today, if we could get that quantity, because like Tony had said, that he had tried to get an order that was canceled due to the quantity, and a lot of stores have limits on how much they'll sell.
Right, but can we purchase through multiple sources?
Yeah, we can definitely try, you know.
So I think that's the first thing we have to do,
I
is we have
guess
to first see if we
what
can
I'm
get.
hearing here is that you guys need guidance, blessing, whatever, from the council to move forward, fix the problem. And I would make a motion that we authorize staff to move forward with whatever's required to fix both the icicle and tree lighting issue. And if it requires applying LED, that's what you guys can do.
Second.
I think, but again, this has to be we understand that this is just an interim measure for this year. We have to look at the larger picture of
That's another issue.
the marquee
Yes.
and the lighting, electrical,
Right.
and the safety issues and everything.
Another question,
Let's deal with this one. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
We do have a motion on the floor, is there any more discussion?
So just so I'm clear, just if I wrap it up, that if we do this fix, we'll be able to provide both power to both the icicle and the trees.
Yes, yeah, as long as the trees, they're being supplied with LED lights, yes, yep.
I just want to make sure.
How do we know that the trees are using LED? Do we actually,
But that was
Just trust-
required. It was, you can walk down the street and you can tell the difference just by looking, and we can do a walkthrough. But we actually required LED lights, made it very clear.
Okay.
Is there any more discussion? And I would say that probably the largest expense in doing this fix is simply staff time and benefits. That's where the real cost is going to be.
Is there a possibility that council could help with replacing those lights as far as the labor is concerned?
What, I'm sorry?
Replacing the icicle lights?
helping with labor, I think, is what she's saying.
That could be, that could go against the labor agreements.
Yeah, exactly,
It's in good
Yeah.
spirit, but I don't think we can get away with it.
Yeah, appreciate the offer, but yeah.
Well, you know what? I want to know the difference then when we have community volunteer time, when we have volunteers all over the city doing all kinds of projects,
We're not.
I
then,
don't think we have time to do
volunteers,
that. I think
they
we
work
just
for us.
need to see if staff can get this scheduled and get it done, let's get it done.
Right.
To organize
But
a crew
we're
of
still working
volunteers
on
just seems
city
crazy.
You know, we're
Time is
management.
management.
Let's take a vote on the motion is to allow staff to make the necessary fixes and purchase the appropriate lights and install those, and hopefully do it as expeditiously as possible, so that we don't interrupt the holiday season until like December or something, so, or Christmas. So, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? Thank you.
And I would stress one word from your description, the hopefully, do it
Oh,
as expeditiously as you can.
Okay,
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
thank you, thank you, Tom. Okay, we are going on to item number 2, which is our Parks Plan update, the scope of work and consultant contract. And Nick, that's yours.
Yes. Before you is a draft contract and scope of work for the update to the city's Parks and Recreation Plan. The city initiated a request for proposal process back in September. I actually did not participate in that process because one of the companies that submitted is my wife's employer. And so after Mark led the selection process and helped Carrie Sully, our long-range planner, form a committee to interview the consultants, they made a recommendation to hire Beckwith Consulting. And so then I jumped back into the project and started negotiating a scope and a fee for the project. In the budget, we have $35,000 for this project, and the mayor had requested that we add a little bit of public outreach related to the community facility, or the community event facility downtown. And so the contract now comes in a little over $42,000. And so still pretty close to our budgeted amount, and I think we have a little bit of flexibility in our professional services line item for the planning department and can hopefully accomplish this task without needing a budget amendment. The scope of work is pretty typical for a project of this size. It involves a significant amount of public outreach, beginning with a city council retreat to just tackle park planning issues and really figure out what your priorities are before going on to the community, and even doing a school survey to find out what the kids in our community are interested in seeing. And the project will result in a completely updated parks plan, parks inventory, parks impact fee calculation, and an implementation strategy for the city. And currently we are ineligible for RCO funding. That's the Recreation Conservation Office. That's who put up $350,000 towards McCormick Village Park. You have to have a parks plan that's less than 6 years old in order to apply for those funds. And so our current plan is from 2011. So we are ineligible until we get that updated and submitted to the state. So the entire plan follows the state framework for this grant program so that we can hopefully go after additional funds in the future. So with that, if there's any questions about the scope, I'm happy to answer those.
Jay?
I'm not quibbling, but I thought I heard you say 42,000.
44, sorry.
44.
I was
Okay.
searching for the number.
Okay, no, okay. I just want to make sure we all had the same number.
Sure.
Thank you.
John?
Nick, did I read correctly that part of this outreach will help establish interest with a new community center here on the waterfront as well?
Yeah, the idea is that it's going to help feed into the programming of that facility and to start asking community members what types of uses they would like to see there, and also evaluate levels of support for potential sources of funding to support a parks program for the city. And so it's an outreach. It's really asking the first questions associated with that and doing some additional targeted outreach specific to that facility. So probably holding at least one open house dedicated to just a community event facility.
We have not, Fred?
I had a question on page 4 or page 22 about the outreach in the survey. They
Sure.
talk about zip code singular. I think they mean plural, because we have 2 different zip codes in the city limits.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that the boundaries are the city limits and not outside of them?
Correct. There's been some discussion about whether, because the city parks serve residents outside the city. I know the mayor's had some conversations with the county about the possibility of looking at a more regional funding option. So I think that's to be ironed out as we kick off the process.
I think it makes sense. I mean, they're gonna be using it whether we like it or not, so.
Well, and I think when we went through the selection process and we were working with the different consultants on the kind of programs and practices they use for these outreach tools, and they have a number of them now, and they've become much more sophisticated. Their ability to have a larger audience is much more readily available than it was, 20 years ago with social media and stuff. So, I think, it's within this framework for them to hold some sort of open house and have some public outreach and go to an event that isn't just city specific, I think get more of this how it gets out of community. And I know that it was at a council meeting from the podium, last meeting, somebody was asking about specifics about, well, how are you going to do outreach for this community center? And so we couldn't speak to it at that point, but we had already talked with the consultant that we were gonna include the community center as a main component of this body of work.
And that's where my question comes in, is we have not yet signed the agreement with the Public Facilities District. So I don't know exactly what our requirements are. And I wanted to make sure, or just, be curious about, is this going to satisfy any of that? Or is this just, we're doing it on our own because we should do it?
So first of all, that interlocal agreement with the Public Facilities District is tentatively scheduled to come to you next week. I don't have the copy back from the Public Facilities District yet we had a couple of final revisions. I'm supposed to get those tomorrow. But yes, this will cover some of that, but it's really meant to interface our parks plan with that facility, which is going to have its own separate pre-design outreach type process. And so we want to make sure that building becomes part of the parks system and part of the parks plan as a facility. And if we end up signing the contract next week with the Public Facilities District, we may do a selection, and we may have somebody on board for the work for the Community Event Center at the same time that we're working on the parks plan. And so this could be
There may be some duplication.
exactly,
in
and
effort. Okay.
it may be more about coordinating the two than having Beckwith do the exclusive outreach for that portion. So we'll see how it shakes out as the process evolves.
There's definitely overlap.
So, I like that it's also gonna give us a cost recovery, or some cost recovery alternatives. On page 23, near the bottom under your indoor recreation goal, it mentions Kitsap County's Gibbons Community Center. I wasn't sure if they were going to poll the users of the center, or if they were thinking, I wasn't sure what they meant to include there.
Well, I think the outreach is under section 2, so this is more about, I think, updating the elements related to our indoor facilities. In the future, that facility is certainly going to also be covered as part of the outreach process.
Okay.
So, I don't know whether some of the users of that facility could end up at the community event center or not. That's to be determined.
Okay, and then on page 21, under task 1A, I didn't see that the seniors, or any seniors were mentioned, or any senior representatives, and I think they should be under task 1A in the second bullet.
Okay, we can ask them to add that language before it comes to you next week, as long as you're comfortable moving forward with the contract next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that and have them add some reference to that.
So was there also consideration in here, and I didn't see it, to the survey that was done 5 or 6 years ago, when Matthews was looking at trying to coordinate with Charlotte, Rita, some sort of a community.
That YMCA.
Yeah.
We'll certainly provide that as
Okay.
information in support of this, yeah.
Okay.
And my comment is number 2, update your inventory programs and facilities. And it's the first task, update your demographic And they say some things here, and it says demographic characters by age group for a 6 to 20-year planning period. And my note was, are they gonna use our numbers from Vision 2050?
I noticed that when I was preparing for the meeting tonight, and I was gonna make a note of that as well, so I can have them reference that
Yeah.
in there as well.
Because it may not, what they give from OFM may not be exactly
Yeah.
how we're gonna do that. Is there any more discussion, or is this good to bring forward, at our, I'm assuming you're gonna bring it forward at our next council meeting, or?
Yeah, the contract will be on the agenda for the next meeting. A very long list of items. Would you like it on the consent agenda if we address these two issues, or would you rather have it,
And what's council's pleasure?
Consent
Consent
would
is
be
fine
fine.
with me.
all right?
Not earth shattering.
Okay, so we will go on to, number 3, which is the Shoreline Master Plan. And Nick, I will have you do that one also.
All right, so we are required to prepare an update to our Shoreline Master Program over the next year and a half. The good news is that we did receive some grant funding from the Department of Ecology to help pay for this work, and it is a fairly light update to our Shoreline Master Program. However, along with that grant money, we are required to adopt a public participation program explaining how we're going to conduct outreach and outlining the schedule and work plan for the project. So at the November Planning Commission meeting, the Planning Commission reviewed the draft resolution and public participation plan and recommended that the City Council approve this. And this is a requirement in order for us to proceed with our ecology grant, and staff's recommendation is that we move forward with it. So if there are any questions on this, please let me know.
Any
Scott,
discussion? Go
I
ahead,
just
Scott.
have one. So this went to land use committee, then the planning commission, and now here, is this different from what we looked at? land use?
No, it hasn't changed.
And you said you expected it to be a light lift, but with climate resiliency as part of this, it could be maybe more than we anticipated.
So with the grant funding, we signed the climate resiliency agreement with Kitsap County that we are piggybacking on a project that they're doing, and we've added to that scope to have a consultant prepare that analysis for us. So that, I think we're kicking off that meeting next week or a week later to start talking about how we're going to do the resiliency study.
That's
And-
that raising the sea level and all.
Yeah, yeah.
I know that I sent Carrie an email on this one, and my concern is our marine industry, because we have several marine industries, and they weren't called out. The only thing that was called out was the postal mail out to Shoreline property owners, which would cover them. But I don't know, I would feel good if we specifically mentioned, because our marine industry is important to us. We've got Kitsap Marine, Sullivan's, Yachtfish, St. Clair Inlet, we've got a lot of them. So, just to name them, that we're going to specifically make sure they get the same communication that the Shoreline property.
Sure, we can add that to the list.
And is this something that will come back for approval?
This is scheduled for next Tuesday unless there's an objection to moving forward with it at this time.
And are we good with that being on the consent agenda?
All right.
Does that make your life easier now?
Makes our meeting shorter.
Okay. Now we're going on to your Title 20 housekeeping amendments.
All right. So, as you all remember, we did a pretty heavy lift on updating our zoning code this past February is when we finally adopted that ordinance, and anytime you roll out something like this, you inevitably have some minor corrections or inconsistencies that have to be cleaned up, and I think this is our second or third housekeeping ordinance dealing with some of these issues. The changes that are in the housekeeping ordinance are pretty wide-ranging, and I would recommend, page 113 in your packet begins the red line copy of those changes. And I just want to walk you through kind of the highlights of what's changing, beginning on page 113. The first change to the definitions chapter of the code 20.12, we had a definition for accessory building in the code, but we didn't also have one for principal building, and we refer to principal and accessory building throughout, so we wanted to add a corresponding definition there. On page, and stop me if you have any questions as we go through this, when you move on to page 116 and 117, and also a deletion on 118, in our public process chapter for permit processing under 20.24, we previously had one big section that talked about our process, and we wanted to make the code read more sequentially in terms of how you go through the process, and so we separated this one big section on page 118 into two little sections on 116 and 117. And so the first of those sections is the application review that says that within 5 days of us receiving an application, we will transmit the application to all departments and agencies that are affected. And then within 10 days of determining an application complete, this is the second section that we added, we
Yeah, my question on that was, we're giving the agencies and the departments 15 days to get back to us. Is that a reasonable time frame?
yes.
And so.
That's
I have a
mostly
question
departments inside the building.
about, well, each effective government agency, so right away I thought of DOT, and if you can get comments back from DOT in 15 days, that's, or Saquonish.
Sure.
So that was my question, is how do we ensure that we're getting comments from DOT and Saquonish or DOE or whatever in 15 days?
Well, usually this is the initial notice of application, not a subsequent SEPA notice, or the review process is typically longer than this, and it's not that we don't accept their materials if they submit it after the fact, but this is just how we're working through the application.
But it says they have 15 days to transmit a comment, and if they don't, then it's presumed to have no comment. Which
Are you on 116 or 117?
116. You and I had the same
Yeah,
question.
and, you know, this would be great, but it might be something that's served with the MOU as well. If you can do that, that's awesome.
Okay, I will, I'm gonna have to get with our senior planner on this and make sure that, I'll get you a more clear explanation for that point. I'm not sure off the top of my head. We began this process in June, and we've been doing a lot since then, so. I think with regard to the 15-day deadline, if you look at what was deleted, there was a 15-day period.
Correct.
And so we've got the 5 plus 10. I think we've just broken it into two pieces. But I will double check that and have a response for you next week when this, yeah. So moving on to page 120, we realized that we put a P in one box off of where it was supposed to be in the building type table. In the neighborhood mixed-use zone, we intended to allow townhomes but not apartments, but we allowed apartments, not townhomes, and we're making this consistent with other language that explains what these zones are intended to do. It was just a typo when we were completing the table. Page 124, this again, this actually amends the building type chapter concerning townhomes. It previously said that townhomes were 2 or more dwelling units where they're separated by a common wall, but that's also a duplex, so it needs to say 3 or more dwelling units. And in this section, we also mentioned the neighborhood mixed-use zone as being one of the districts where that is allowed. see, page 128. The R1 zone, with the way that it was worded, it was a little misleading because it made it sound like you could have a 1,200 square foot residential lot. You can do that with a cottage development, but not other types. We just rephrased it to make it more clear to the reader what was meant there, meaning that you can have either a 5,000 or 6,000 square foot minimum lot size for detached houses. Cottage courts have a totally different standard. Next, beginning on page 131 and going through quite a few chapters, we realized that accessory buildings, they are intended to be allowed in all zones, but we didn't actually say that they were allowed in all zones, and we wanted to clarify that. Page 152, the new code includes what's called the build-to zone, and this is part of a form-based code is describing to the reader when you want buildings to be brought up to the street's edge for like a storefront or a building type where you want a certain amount of building out at the street rather than having the parking lot in front of a building. And we realize that there's some situations where it may be impossible to meet this standard. And the example that we would give is if we allow a commercial driveway, which has to be at least 25 feet wide, and if you have an 80% build-to zone requirement, meaning 80% of your lot has to be building, and the remaining percent can be side setbacks and driveways, you can't actually meet our commercial driveway minimum width standard. So we wanted to create an exception that allowed for situations where if you have critical areas along your frontage, if you have to accommodate a side setback plus a minimum driveway width, that the build-to zone can be reduced to the minimum necessary to allow you to actually use the property. So that's just a minor cleanup that's meant to provide flexibility so that you don't have to request a variance. That was 152. Additionally, on that page, we realized that we had, let's see, we do allow, it said that the industrial zones were exempt from the building type chapter. That's not correct. We allow general buildings and we allow accessory buildings there. And so that's just a cleanup to be consistent with the table at the beginning of that chapter. We had a remnant from a mobile home temporary use permit chapter. We have no idea where that language came from or what it was for, but it allowed for the city council to grant permits for a temporary mobile home. As far as we can tell, the city council is not interested in being involved directly in permitting decisions. We're trying to remove that responsibility. And so we have a separate temporary use provision in the code, but this individual chapter, we didn't see a need for it to remain. Moving on page 152, the subdivision chapter, when we adopted the interim subdivision code in 2015, one of the things we added was a description of how the subdivision document is prepared and what signature blocks had to be on there and various statements. Somehow that got removed as we adopted the permanent subdivision code, and our clerical staff, who has to go and get signatures and make sure that the forms when they come in meet the requirements of the code, we're saying it would be really helpful for us to clearly tell people what needs to be written on the face of the plat, and so that was requested to be added back into the subdivision chapter, and this will make it, I think, easier for surveyors and engineers to prepare documents and clearly meet the city requirements.
So, Nick, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So a couple of sessions back, the legislature allowed for, or passed an RCW that allowed for final plats to skip legislative authority and go straight for signature by the director.
Yes.
And the others. Was that also for the cities?
It was for the cities, and we looked at that chapter and it did not make sense to us because when usually as part of a subdivision, you're accepting dedications and are accepting property. So any new street that comes in, any new pipes, those dedications we felt like needed to be accepted by the city council, and we wanted to know what you were accepting and have a say in that process rather than delegating it to staff. So we chose not to go down that road. Our final plat process is pretty seamless. I mean, we typically, if we get a complete final plat application, we can have signatures in, 2.5 weeks, barring the rare fifth Tuesday of the month.
Okay.
So it's not too much of a hassle, and we want to make sure that you understand what you're accepting, because there's a lot of information on those documents. If you would like to explore that, we certainly can, but it's,
Well, I think the driver for that was the amount of time that it takes to get those recorded sometimes. You gotta get a recordation number, signatures, and then for the legislative body to get to it, it can take some time. And
Mhm.
that's at the point where your holding costs are the highest, and so it really is the will of the council whether they want to be advised of it or have their thumb more on it. And maybe that's a retreat discussion as well, or maybe not.
Sure. The other part of the final plat, we usually pass a resolution, and in that resolution, you're approving bond language, and so there are agreements that are being approved, and so you would be giving staff the authority to approve those documents, and so we might be getting to the point where it makes sense to do that, but
Yeah, but it's
I always,
also, I think, an affirmation that what is being recorded is what was approved at preliminary at the same time.
definitely.
We can have a-
The next section, if you go to page 158, let's see. So we have design standards that we wrote. If you remember, Maker's Architecture wrote Chapter 127, which was our first stab at creating commercial and multifamily residential standards. And then we also had single-family and duplex standards, and when we adopted the form-based code, we had to sort of integrate the form-based code into two different sets of design standards. And so we cleaned up some of the language about what building types are subject to the standards in Title 127.020. And we also clarified that the subdivision's design standards, when you're subdividing for single-family lots, are in a totally different chapter altogether, because we didn't want users looking in this chapter trying to find that information. And then on page 159, we had a couple of people come in wanting to build structures that did not fit into our design standards at all. And if you want to build like a gazebo at a park or a sort of a freestanding structure, it's supposed to have a minimum amount of windows. And of course, those buildings don't have windows. So we wanted to provide an opening for just atypical building types that don't really fit clearly into our design standards, to make sure that we're not hanging people up on trying to develop those types of projects. On page 161, we had an inconsistency concerning driveway widths for townhomes. You'll see that appears I believe that comes up in a subsequent section that we're going to see here. Page 166. We had an inconsistency in terms of the amount of window glazing or facade transparency in this section versus the form-based code section, and so we wanted to make sure that those numbers were consistent. They had been 15 here, they've increased to 20% to be consistent with what's in 20.32. And then finally, on page 169, previously our code said that a landscape plan can be prepared by a landscape architect, a certified horticulturalist, or an other qualified individual. And so that put the burden on me to determine who is qualified and who isn't. I had a hard time the first time somebody came in and said, I would like to know if I'm qualified to do this. And I said, do I ask for a CV? I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to make that determination. So we did find that there is a third type of certified professional that's a certified landscape designer, but we wanted to delete that other qualified individual because I don't want to be put in that position and tell somebody that they're not qualified. So I think that is, there was one other correction on 171. We had just made a transcription error in the table where a cell got dragged and copied a couple of times, and it said that an attached house could only have one parking stall despite being 74 feet wide. That was supposed to be 40 to be consistent with other building types, and so we had a couple of typos in that table that we are fixing. And this is also on page 172, just after that table, is where the townhome driveway width standards have been moved to.
I don't understand number 3. I mean, I guess I understand it, but the building in which townhomes are contained must be at least 30 feet wide to have a shared driveway.
I think it's because if your townhome is less than 30 feet wide, you're not allowed a front driveway at all. So when you're doing shared driveways, you have to have,
Okay.
we don't want your entire facade of a townhome being your garage or parking area. So that's a rundown of the changes. There's 1 or 2 items I will check with my staff on and get you a response at the next meeting, and I'll be prepared to share that with you, and I can probably email you tomorrow with a response on that. But are you comfortable with this moving forward to your next council meeting?
Yes.
And this, I think, should be on the regular agenda.
Yes,
And not
yeah.
the consent agenda. Yeah. One thing
Especially
that,
considering he's gonna clarify a couple things and share with us.
right. So. We will move on to amending the deadline for abatement, order appeals. And Nick,
Yes, so
did you talk at all, Mark?
Later.
I-
Oh, later, okay.
I would have appreciated some breaking up of the items. I feel like I'm a little winded.
Do you want to? We can.
No.
This one's real fast, so.
Get it over with.
Yeah.
Code Enforcement Officer Price brought a issue to my attention recently that it's in chapter 9.30, which is our nuisance chapter of our code, and it says that appeals of nuisance abatements are to be heard by the city council. While all of 9.30 probably needs a pretty comprehensive update, we are not prepared to do that at this time. However, because the municipal judge agreed to be our hearing officer for dangerous building abatements, the idea here is that we would transfer responsibility for nuisance appeals from the city council to the hearings officer that we designated just recently for building abatements. So this is an ordinance that is just changing the city council responsibility to the hearing officer and keeping you guys from.
If any kind of abatement appeals, things go to Superior Court, not to our municipal court. I'm looking, is there a conflict or potential conflict?
They would go to Superior Court, correct?
So it's not gonna affect our judge.
Correct. We did talk with the judge. There may be circumstances where the person who is subject to an abatement is also involved in other criminal issues, and so he may have a situation where he would need to ask one of the alternates to sit in for him, but he has an agreement, I believe, with judges at the county that they will cover for each other in those situations.
So any potential conflict can be dealt with.
Correct. So, and if it's okay, that will come forward next week as well, and that one, I think, is, a code amendment should be on the business items.
Is there any comment on the abatement appeal process? Are we good on that? Okay. We will move on then to the McCormick Woods amendment to the 2007 reimbursement agreement for the utility system improvements. Okay, and we'll let both of you talk this time.
Nick will carry most of the weight on this one. Mine
Yes,
is
so,
Bremerton, Port Orchard.
Okay.
so, as you all are aware, we imposed a moratorium on the western area of the city that encompasses McCormick Woods and McCormick West. That was in June of this year. That moratorium has been amended a few times, and we have been actively working with both the city of Bremerton and McCormick communities, as well as South Kitsap Fire, on solutions to our water situation there. The city council approved last meeting an agreement with Bremerton, and my understanding is Bremerton is going to be having a second reading, or have they had that already?
No, we're on the 20th.
So Bremerton's second reading on the agreement that we approved last meeting is on the 22nd, and so before next meeting, we will have confirmation that they have approved that document. We have an agreement now with South Kitsap Fire and Rescue. It's a 2-page document that just concerns fire flow storage at the 580 reservoir. And the third part of our solution to the water situation has to do with amending the 2007 reimbursement agreement for utility system improvements, which the city council approved before Mark and I were here, but back in 2007. And this involved a planned construction of a reservoir at the current 580 reservoir site, but a new reservoir, and allowed for a reimbursement of $1,000 per ERU after that facility was brought online. And so we wanted to use that existing agreement because we're still trying to build a reservoir to fix our water source issues. We wanted to use the existing framework to move forward with a solution. And so the amendment that is before you includes a number of provisions, most importantly that McCormick is agreeing to build a new reservoir. They are agreeing to drill the pilot hole for the Well 12 project, which is additional source. They're going to post a bond to ensure the construction of the reservoir, and I believe the reservoir is supposed to be online within 18 months is what has been agreed to. They're going to construct a second transmission main between the new reservoir and the McCormick Woods area. That'll go through the future McCormick West development. And they're going to construct other improvements associated with the reservoir, pumps and other equipment that is required to make that system operational. And ultimately, this is going to allow the city to separate the McCormick, or the city's western water system from the Bremerton system by having 2 separate reservoirs out there. And of course, the Bremerton agreement that we just approved transferred the city's reservoir to Bremerton in exchange for additional water source. There is one other agreement that is outstanding that Bremerton is also taking action on. I believe that hasn't been approved yet, correct, Mark? The McCormick-Bremerton agreement? I think they're having a second reading on that as well on the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken. So
We're going to make sure that that's done before the 26th, but I'm not sure that's
So McCormick has agreed to bring Bremerton's well 1R, which was a drilled but not operational well online, and that's how Bremerton has agreed to increase the water source coming to the city on an interim basis.
Plus some improvements to 2A with emergency power and things, and then a water main that comes up.
Yeah. So this agreement is a solution to our water problem. It will, once it is approved and once the other agreements have all been executed, it allows, or once they've been approved, it allows us to lift the moratorium in McCormick Woods. And so,
The 580 zone.
correct, the 580 zone. And the plan for this at this time would be there's the South Kitsap agreement, which would be voted on first, followed by this McCormick amendment to the 2007 agreement, followed by an ordinance to lift the moratorium at the next meeting. And that's currently what is on the tentative agenda for next week.
And that's, like Mark just said, that will be contingent upon the agreement between McCormick and Bremerton having been done.
Correct.
Their meeting just before.
Correct.
Our meeting on the 26th.
If the Bremerton agreement for some reason does not get approved, we would either postpone all items for 2 more weeks, or it's possible that pieces, I think the fire agreement could move forward, but they're all moving kind of on the same track, and even if we approve them, we probably don't sign them until everything has been approved.
Yeah, the feedback I got from City of Bremerton was that their first reading went well. There were no concerns, and they don't anticipate any issues on the 20th.
And I will say the McCormick has submitted new calculations for a new reservoir, and so Jackie in the water department is reviewing that right now, and they seem to be moving forward. We also got them the bond forms, and so the bond, which per this agreement they have to post within 90 days, they're working on getting that together so that everything goes as we've outlined it here.
And then the pilot hole, I think they're getting ready to actually start that within the next 2 weeks.
entire section in our packet. I thought it was very clear. I thought it was very understandable. And I really appreciated that. I don't know who wrote it, whether it was Jennifer or whoever did it. I thought they did a very nice job because a layperson could get through it. So I was grateful for that.
I just noted that it wasn't included in the electronic version,
That-
so,
It was a separate email.
okay.
I have a paper copy if you need it.
I,
Okay.
in this paper packet that is pulled out,
Just emailed separately.
Right, and that was one of the things we were waiting with approval from our attorney, because we didn't know whether it was a public document yet or not, or whether that section was gonna be moved to an executive session, or whether we wanted Jennifer on the phone and make her first, so we had a lot of moving parts.
yeah, understandable. I've
And-
got a copy so I can.
There will be two minor corrections to this. Jackie Brown, our water system manager, sent under the recitals under G, rather than saying it's going to help the Port Orchard serve the 580 zone, it says it's going to augment the water supply. And under section 2E, it currently says Department of Health. We're going to add Office of Drinking Water, so there will be just real minor changes between now and next
Okay.
week.
Go ahead, Scott.
So on page 5, paragraph 7, it speaks about moratorium. And first I found, well, so I got an observation and a couple comments. I found it a little unusual that we would give McCormick an opportunity to address the council on a proposed moratorium, and usually those are emergency driven. And if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. But then I think we should add some language that would suggest that they have an opportunity to first address the council at the next scheduled meeting, so that they can't say, we're gonna come and address you in a month's time, for example. And then in the, last sentence, where we may impose a new moratorium, and in such case, McCormick waives its rights to challenge that moratorium, would they also, or should they also be waiving their rights to advance notice and comment in that instance as well?
I can ask those questions of Jennifer Robertson, our land use attorney.
Okay. But I go back to, it seemed a little odd to give somebody an opportunity to comment on something that's usually an emergency measure.
I think the idea here is that we have our head wrapped around the water system to the point that we are more actively monitoring it, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, based on the fact that they have a very competent water engineer on board who's designing these facilities, and they're gonna be drilling the well and have an idea
Right.
of where we're at.
I also sensed that it probably was a point that they really wanted in here, and that's fine,
Correct.
but then maybe there should be some clarifying language.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Please.
So I remember when we had several discussions about this, that there was the 1998 agreement and the 2007. And I may have missed it, but I thought we were trying to make sure that basically that, I don't want to say that those agreements were null and void and everything in this agreement now moves forward, but am I missing something? You know, because there were some provisions from the 1998 that had gotten us in trouble. And so does that really, for lack of better words, free us from that agreement? And, you know, somebody can't go back and say, well, you said this, and
I thought that this
therefore
agreement was going to address,
Pardon?
I thought this new agreement.
superseded, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, is that clear enough? That was my question.
Yeah, and I think that, I'm looking through this right now because I believe somewhere in here it talks about the parties agreeing to an additional agreement in the or we're going to pursue an additional agreement.
Right.
And so those outstanding issues from the 1998 agreement will be addressed as part of the next agreement, which also is going to cover transportation issues, plat extensions. And so I think part of what we are seeking in that is probably well 12 improvements to actually make it, bring it online, but also a release from from the 98
Okay,
agreement.
so we're going in good faith then,
Correct,
without having that release first.
correct.
Okay.
And they are dismissing the lawsuit that they have filed
I
but
saw
not
that.
served
Right.
as part of this.
Yes, there will be more agreements coming before.
There's the global agreement that's still.
Right.
I just remember the 98 one
Right,
got us into
exactly.
trouble, and I'm just wondering, do we need, I'll be blunt, I don't know if we need stronger language saying that, supersedes the 98 one now as opposed to later, but I'll defer to the.
I also asked that question of the attorney because I didn't see the reference in there, and I think she said that because we're using the 2007 agreement, and this is a relatively narrow scoped agreement aimed at fixing the immediate problem, that, we were gonna put that onto the subsequent agreement.
I know that this has been discussed a number of times, that there, and I'm assuming if this had been a new agreement, it would have been addressed in this, but again, next, because this is just an amendment to the 2007, the global agreement is gonna be the one that it supersedes all previous agreements. So that's my understanding.
Is there any level of certainty that we are in fact gonna have it subsequent to this agreement, or?
We have to have it.
Well, the alternative is that they're going to build 2,500 lots in 10 years' time, which I think is quadruple the current absorption rate that they've been able to achieve out there. So I think it's pretty unrealistic that they're actually going to be able to use their entitlement in the amount of time, and they're going to have to seek that extension. So they will seek a plat extension, which is our opportunity to request that.
Right, we still have leverage. This is further forward.
Scott, or Sean, do you have anything?
No.
Cindy or Fred, any comments on this?
No, I was just wondering, and not making any paranoid, but at what point do we stop talking about agreements in public? It's a rhetorical question. I just,
Start talking about who in public?
at what point do we stop talking about agreements in public? At what point does it become privileged?
I think because this is a draft that you're considering voting on, it's important that the public get a chance to see what you're considering and that you deliberate it in public.
Right, we had a number of work study or executive sessions building up to this point, and those were not public, but this is the point where they start becoming public documents.
Yeah, and again, I think that's again why Becca and I held it up, because we weren't certain. We had the same questions. We want to make sure before we went out to the public that this was the appropriate time, and then Jennifer reassured us, yes, this is the time to put it out there in public for the whole council to talk about in the public as well. So this is the right time and it's appropriate.
In a utility committee, we talked in generalities, that we had never provided actual documents, because they were still in working draft, or working, drafts, but not an actual document to be moved forward. So we've kept those out of those packets as well. So I think we're hitting, there is a time when they do become public, and I think we've been pretty good at following that.
Any more questions on that? It sounds like you'll have some more conversations with Jennifer, and you'll bring this forward, and after we have assurances that Burlington has executed the agreements they need to, that puts these into place.
Yeah, we'll pull these from the agenda if we don't have the two Burlington agreements ratified. And then we'll start working on the global agreement with McCormick for that area. And then we'll start tackling areas of the city.
Okay, well, we got through that one, and I have to express appreciation to the council. I have either talked to everyone in person or left them messages to have reviewed this and brought any substantive questions. So we're moving forward.
20 minutes ahead of schedule.
Yeah,
Good
so
job.
this is great. But then, yeah, there's three more. And Mark, the next one is yours. It's the local road safety plan and a street safety grant.
Yeah, so let me frame this before I get into the actual summary. So remember that we have an ADA transition plan, we have pavement management system.
Right.
We know we want to establish an executive or this is really working under that framework. So we're not replacing, what we're really looking at is, we know that what came out of the ADA transition plan and the payment management system was, you know, to maintain these, you're gonna have $1.5 million in roads and $1 million in sidewalks, and we just don't have the ability to fund that, and especially now with I-976, that goal line got moved even further. What we're looking at is there are dollars, and if you go into awards through either Safe Routes to School or, you know, WashDOT city safety programs, you know, we're not talking loads of dollars, but there are dollars that, you know, are available, 25 in the WashDOT safety and the 18 million for the Safe Routes to School. They're out there that we have never, you know, gone after in the past. And we really think that with the money that we've put into the budget, which I think we have 70,000 in this current budget that just kind of deals with sidewalks, repairs and maintenance, and we still do some of that. But we're better spent taking some of that money that's really not getting us anywhere and put it into getting this safety grant, local road safety plan, which now we can add that to our ADA plan and our pavement management system, and it dovetails in nicely to have that. And that's gonna allow us the ability to pursue a whole different pool of money. And the reason we wanna move ahead now and utilize our current sidewalk funding instead of waiting until the transportation ad hoc committee gives us some money, we know that this is gonna be a function of that. We'll miss this coming cycle if we do that. So really, the long and the short of it is that we're really looking at utilizing a portion of our sidewalk construction and repair budget to get going on this plan, so that gives us one more tool in the tool belt. And I kinda hate always overusing that term, but it does. And it's gonna give us the ability to start applying for some of these projects that could give us actual real money to do then some projects. So I think it's a worthwhile venture to divert some of the money that's really just chipping away, not getting us down the road, to give us a better opportunity to get more funding. And this is a requirement to get into that program.
Mark, where do these funds come from?
The,
You've listed the different programs, but what funds those programs? This isn't something that is gonna be affected by 976, or are these federal dollars that pass through the state, or where's the original source of dollars coming from?
that's a good question, and I know that I didn't see in the 976 hit list, I didn't see these programs on that list. That I can find that out before we, you know, if we go down this path, before we bring an actual contract forward, we'll verify the funding. Let me look through.
The other question I have is, I mean, if it's a pass-through of federal dollars, that infamous clock start ticking. I noticed that some of these projects in here were design only, so that, you know, the planning stuff doesn't start that clock. So I was just curious.
Yeah, that'll depend on, again, the funding source, I think.
Right.
So I think we'll,
Safe Routes to School is federal.
Safe Routes to School is federal.
Mark, will we be looking at 3 parallel grants then? Or will the safety plan inform on which one of these we go after?
The safety plan allows us to go after either.
We could do all 3.
Oh, yeah, and then the bikes, yeah, we can do all 3. Yeah, this is it's like the base requirement
Yeah.
to qualify for any of these programs.
You could have three separate grant requests, one for each one of these buckets.
I think that's great.
It's great too. Do you have an idea of what the cost of the plan development would be of that $70,000?
We've had some initial conversations with the consultant, and I think a number that's, I thought 44,000, something like that was maybe a number that I remember. So it's definitely gonna be within the funding that, the budget authority that we have.
It doesn't make sense.
So I will concern if these 3 programs, or if they're federal dollars, if the federal dollars, just allows us to cast our net a little wider, rather than being focused on chipping away at little things, so. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and, put an advertisement together or a selection process, and we'll get moving on, because we obviously want to get ready for this next cycle.
So just one last question. By doing this, though, we're not threatening our ADA compliance.
No, this should help our ADA compliance.
Right, okay.
Because we'll have that document that we've taken, Ian Smith, our civil engineer, has already taken that document, he's created a new spreadsheet that makes it more usable. And that document then can be to whoever consultant we have, so that they've already got a list of kind of ranked projects and even paper management system. So I think we can funnel, or they're all interrelated. So we can pull from the ADA and the paper management system and, mine out projects that are in those that fall into these buckets. So that's why I wanted to remind everybody that we still have these overreaching plans that we already have in place. And then this is kind of the third component that then will all come to this new transportation ad hoc committee as we move through. But first we have to get started with getting the consultant on board and pulling it all together.
Any more comments on figuring out how we can get more money? That was kind of the
Good
bottom-
job.
That was the bottom line on that one. Brandy, I think I have your name on the next two, and I had, a question. Do we wanna flop those?
I think so. I have the same question.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
You can, it's my understanding that the first one, there are no adjacent property owners other than the city of Orchard, so you have one petitioner, no adjoining property owners, based on, from what I understand, the conversation at the land use committee when we met, but absolutely, if you want to flop them, that's fine.
I have one council member ask me, and
I just think it's good to inform it. I mean, it's just, I think with all the debate we had last week, I think it's good to maybe just go through the process and remind all of us that we agree with secrecy, we have multiple petitioners or one petitioner, 2/3, and I think it just kind of clarifies it.
Value of property.
Right.
okay,
Since we're gonna do them both tonight anyway, I think the one informs the other.
okay. Then we will do that. Are you gonna move over this way, or are you?
I can.
Stay there? I think a lot of the documentation was behind the first one.
I shall.
I'll kind of step in, Randy, and just, for me, I think it's important, kind of listening to the conversation last week and having been involved with a number of these over the years. I think really what we're trying to ferret out at the end of the day is what's actually allowed as a process under the RCW versus what we may have been doing as a practice. And I think it's important that staff and council walk away from this meeting completely understand what we may have been doing in practice may not have necessarily been the best way to have gone. Because I know that what we've done in practice over the last 11 years since I've been here hasn't necessarily been what we had talked about last week. And so I think there's what we do have done as a practice versus what we potentially can do as an RCW. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to have an outcome from this conversation, is to
And-
make it very clear.
I'm just going to, for the record, for anyone who is, watching us, in that our discussion on the next two items is vacating city right-of-ways. And we had one issue before us at council last week, and we came back with questions on it. And since then, we have another petition for another vacation, so.
And we had continued that agenda.
And we had continued that agenda item. And so the way they were on our agenda was the new one first, and council has expressed a desire to put the old one first and then go to the new one.
Well, it's not so much the old one, it's the
Process.
The process.
Process.
Yes,
Okay,
process.
The process.
And I think it's also important to understand that the 90% of what we're talking about is we're talking about unopened right of way versus open right of way. Because if you have open right of way, you don't have the fee simple ownership with an easement right. You're talking about where you still have that fee simple ownership in place with the easement right as a potential easement right and not an open easement right. So I think it's important that we're really looking at unopened right of way where you have fee simple ownership to the center of that potential public access and easement as kind of a foundation.
Okay, Frankie, we'll let you.
Yes, so legal counsel and I sat down last week and kind of went through our documents and did a how did we get here type of approach. And so what we did is we went back to look to see how we essentially got here. And so the code was amended in 2014 to add basically RCWs. The prior code did not state any RCWs. It just kind of did a summary. It was a very short code, if I remember correctly. At that time, when we added the RCWs, we also changed the structure and how the petitioner pays for the vacation. So there's a resolution 1990 that was adopted by the council in 2002, and we continued that whole process all the way up until 2014. So what that process was is that a petitioner, which is the person that fills out the paperwork that says, my property adjoins a valley or some sort of unopened right-of-way, right? An alley, not a valley.
In Blackjack Creek is about.
Okay, there you go. So I want to vacate that right away. What's the process? And so at that time, the process was that the petitioner had to fill out a form, the person had to fill out a form that described the area that they wanted to vacate. They also had to, based on the vacation area, if it was commercial property, they had to pay $10 per square foot that they wanted to vacate. And if it was commercial, they had to pay $5 per square foot for residential. I said that twice. And so when they, based on that value, they were to provide the form, they had to provide the check, they had, the city held on to the check, and then they had to provide a legal description prepared by a licensed surveyor. If they had adjoining property owners that touched that vacation that they wanted to do, they also had to have more than 2/3 of the adjacent property owners sign a piece of paper that says, yes, we don't mind, we want to vacate our property. So from 2002 all the way to 2014, that was the process. The petitioner, the one that presented it to the council, paid everything up front. And then once it went to council, they made the decision is yes, they want to vacate it, no, they don't, they want to adjust the boundaries. But the public hearing process was still all the same, the noticing the property was still all the same. And then once the council approved it, then we actually cashed the check and then recorded the ordinance with the county, and they adjusted the legal descriptions to attach that it was a vacation.
In those scenarios, though, you were talking about, let's say it's a 40-foot easement, and you have this property that was abutting, and they, in essence, just vacated along their width 20 feet of that, but the rest of the unopened right-of-way stayed intact as unopened right-of-way.
And
It
what I
wasn't-
heard you say, they did not pay anything based on appraised value. They paid a fee based on the square footage.
Correct. And so that was one of the things that we corrected in 2014 was to match the RCW. The RCW state that they had to have an appraised value of either 50%, and then they have to pay either 50% or 100% depending on how long the city has had it for unopened right-of-way, which is 25 years. It's, I believe, 100%. Under 25 is 50%.
Right, so there's the distinction there is whether it's an open right-of-way as opposed to an open right-of-way. If it's been open and used by the public for 25 years or more, or if the city bought it at public expense, then the city is entitled to more compensation when it releases the easement right.
Correct.
So it depends on the scenario.
Correct. And so there is a little correction that I do have to make with Mark is back prior to 2014 and prior, when we sent that recording, we cashed the check and we sent that ordinance to the county, they actually adjusted the property owners, and when you look at their legal description, it says vacated per ordinance number blah, blah, blah. So not only did the petitioner, which is the person that presented and paid, but all the adjacent property owners' legal descriptions that it affected got that. So they were assessed new tax rolls without additional payment to the city.
Well, what I'm saying is we didn't necessarily, if you had a 100-foot long, like 40-foot wide alley, and you had one person in the middle that had an encroachment, and they were just trying to clear that encroachment, they didn't vacate the whole alley.
No, they just did a piece.
They just
Correct.
did their piece, so theoretically, you could go 40, 40, 40,
Yeah.
20, 40, 40, 40, and if nobody else was affected, and that's kind of what was different on this 413 deal is,
Right.
it didn't make sense to leave that whole thing as unopened right away.
Right.
But then that led to these other issues of, well, what about home signs? They may not want it, and
Right.
so, you know, a simple thing where we would just do this one strip and not touch the rest of them.
Yeah, and that would be the council's decision. So when the code was amended in 2014 to add the RCWs, change the appraisal value, staff processed all the vacations the same way that we have in the past. There was, meaning that whoever puts it forward, they do all the payment of it, and the adjacent property owners, the only benefit that they get is, I don't know if it's a benefit or not, but they get added to their the tax rolls. They just don't have to pay for the legal description and the value of the property.
But the city was still receiving the full amount of value
Correct.
that it's allowed to under the statute.
Right. So they have to, correct,
It came from one person instead of.
Correct.
Multiple.
But that's only if that's what was proposed. Again, you could have a scenario where
Right.
you have all these adjacent lots, and you're only gonna vacate the one that's, that portion that's
Correct.
on that frontage.
Yeah.
You don't just necessarily do the whole lot.
right. And the council, so that's how it got changed, that's how the clerk's office processed the application. Then we went back, so that's how we started, that's where we're at now. Then we looked at the aspect of, does the council even have the authority to do that? And so from what we gathered is looking at the RCW. The RCW does not state whether you are required or have to. It says that the council, and I have to lead to may.
With regarding payment.
Mhm.
So, yeah, there's three scenarios. One is that, well, two scenarios for this example. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So there's a scenario, if the council wants to do a street vacation of its own, on its own resolution, you have the option of not requiring payment from those abutting property owners. If you have a situation where there's a strip of land that there's no use for the city, you don't want it anymore, you can just, upon your own initiative, pass a resolution to vacate that street or alley and not require payment. Then it just goes onto the abutting property owner's tax rolls, and we're done. So I think that's part of what added to the complexity of this particular one, is that there's a portion of what we were talking about could have been addressed that way, and a portion of it was, falls strictly within, or squarely within the scenario where a petitioner has brought forward a petition and they have to pay 50% of the value of the underlying fee. So it does get a little bit confusing about who has to pay and who doesn't. And we have the resolution 1990, which gives some policy guidelines to staff and the public about how these are going to be handled, but it doesn't address who pays. And so what the clerk's office has been going on is how things have been handled to date. But it's still within your.
Let me just make sure I understand our options. One is that, and we'll use this recent application as an example, they're asking to vacate the portion that's abutting their property so that they can alleviate an encroachment issue. The committee decided that it would be best to vacate it all. But we don't know if the adjoining properties on everything else is interested in compensating the city for it. So our options are, one is we could just vacate 50% into the right-of-way for this one property owner and they pay us, and leave the rest in the city's control, if you will. Or two, we could
everybody. I think we still have an obligation for the first petitioner, so
So we could charge the first petitioner, but let everybody else have their portion of it for no charge.
Because at that point, it's the city who's requesting the
Correct.
vacation, it's not the property owner.
Right, and as long as 50% of those property owners don't object, we can go ahead and do that, because they do have the option of objecting.
But we don't have to vacate it all, we can just
No.
vacate the portion that we're being asked to and leave it as it's been for the last however many years in city's control.
So if we
Correct.
had decided 2 years ago that we didn't like that hillside, we could have just said, look, we're gonna vacate the whole thing, and it would have just, without any
no,
notice.
you have to still go through the vacation council has to go through the same vacation process as the, general public petitioner, so,
Public
so you have to hold a public hearing, they still have to put notice to the, adjacent property owners that are affected. And then if 51 or 50%
If 50% object. the
in
city
writing that they
cannot
don't want it, then the
vacate it.
council cannot move forward with the public hearing, period.
But
It just stops.
Because this particular individual that's already turned in an application, we can't go down that road, so we can do one of those. So we could, at this point, just approve that one vacation on that one piece and just say that's it. And the city could then choose, we'll clean up the rest of it just
At a later date.
Whenever.
at another time.
Or you can add to it now and we discontinue the
Well,
process.
wasn't part of the issue that this person, the applicant, had encroachments into the other half of the right of way as well, so that we really needed to involve the list?
But did we have, wouldn't we have to ask the abutting property on the other side if they're interested?
Mhm.
Which I thought
We
that
have.
they were.
We have.
Right.
Well,
She's here.
We just made
She's
it-
on one side of it, Melissa's on the other side. We have to get Melissa's okay that he's not interested in owning 50% of that right of way before we can let it go to the entire right of way to the one property.
Well, so she's, the petitioner has gotten the signatures of the lists to, support, in
Give
support.
up
On
their
both of their
rights,
property.
or just, we're not gonna oppose a vacation, which is it?
They're not gonna oppose the vacation, which means she only gets 50%
Right,
and he gets
that's the
50%. Yeah,
So he may want 50%, which in essence won't relieve the encroachment issue.
Right.
which becomes a civil matter at
Yeah,
that point.
that's,
Right.
Okay, so that's,
And they
Now,
can't
there's
get to
no
the,
resolution.
yeah, they can't get to the civil matter unless we release that first layer, which is,
Plus, there was a property adjustment. There was a,
Triangle.
yeah, triangle
well, that was
adjustment to
the
the,
properties on both sides, just to clean it all up and get
Yeah,
rid of
we have
it.
it.
so they're trying to
We
get
haven't
that of the
talked to
city's
them.
review, so it becomes this ability to be discussed in civil. Now, they could do what we did there off of Tacoma, west of Tacoma, where the situation was that the person had something that was in the middle on both sides, and that person, the city vacated that, they vacated the whole thing, but the petitioner that needed, that had the encroachment, actually bought
yeah,
the other half.
separately
Yeah.
after.
Yeah. yeah.
But I would assume that you can't make the assumption that that other person wants to give up their rights to buy that, so.
Yeah, and this, what we did off of Tacoma. was
Right,
that
no, I appreciate what we did. We had-
Agreed.
We had blessing on both sides of
Yes.
the right of way, but until we get blessing, all we can do is say, yeah, we're gonna do it, and it's up to this property to pay the city.
And I suspect that since there is encroachment now on private property, I don't know how code enforcement gets involved in that aspect as in containing the deck that is now rotting. So do they go in and enforce it, or do they give them time to address the civil matter? Or do they, code enforcement goes in and say, hey, this deck is unsafe, you now have to remove it?
Yeah, but that's a
That's a
separate
different-
issue from vacation.
First, we have to make it
Yeah.
right of way, potential right of way, right of way.
Quick question, when we started the land use committee, took it from this one little petitioner request and made it much larger, did we give the proper notification to those people to object so we could receive the 50% approval?
Yes, all letters went to all of the adjacent property owners.
Even Hollison's? Did they-
Yes.
Okay.
But-
I did not get a response from them, but I did get a call from the list.
But what I'm hearing is that for us to do that, even though they're not objecting, they're gonna have to agree to pay us for it.
No.
No,
Not, cons-
No.
not if we initiate it.
not
But
if
we're
you guys
not.
continue
I thought that once we have, how can we make the petitioner pay for this portion and give the rest away? That doesn't make
Why
sense.
do we do that? We could do that.
Because that's your authority under the
Well, it sounds like
RCW.
there's two scenarios. One is if it's under 25 years, we could collect no more than 50%. And if it's over 25, we can collect no more than 100%. None of it says that we have to collect less than 50% or 100% either. It sounds like it's our
I thought we had to do.
Yeah, you may collect
Yeah,
less.
that's a phrase, but-
Okay, but we don't have to collect less. We could, if we wanted to, leave money on the table.
No, so I think it's minimum of 50%.
It seems like we should just let this particular thing go through and resolve it. We just, staff, you know, maybe I started all this. and I
Well, the
said,
problem is I have 3 other street vacations that want to come through,
Yeah, I
and
don't
all
think
have
we
adjacent
could
property
just-
owners.
That's kind of like dealing with the lights downtown, let's just look the other way. That's-
Yeah, so you may collect less.
Yeah, it's an amount which shall not exceed 25, 50% or 100%.
So may, which means
That's
it's
on page
advisory but not
215.
required.
the city
Sort of in the
wanted
middle
to
of
clean
the,
rest of it, that would be up to us.
Yeah, and considering that right-of-way was from an original addition to the city, I mean, it's over 100 years old, and it's not like we paid for it. It was.
No, I think the last guy understood that we could not collect more than 50%, even if we wanted to.
right,
And here it is, we could if we wanted to.
we
The
can
thing is,
accept
do we
less than
want
that.
to collect for all of the land, or do we want to charge part of it and not charge the rest? I think that's the question.
And that's the council's, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're unknown to this right now, we don't know what the appraised value is, I mean, it could come back at $80, we're really not talking about anything.
Actually, there was something in the packet last week that said basically had a value of 0.
Well, no, that was an agent saying that it virtually had no value by itself.
And that was the problem with the old resolution, is that the $10 per square foot, it's not based on an appraisal, it was just, yeah, it's arbitrary.
I think it makes sense, we've kind of muddied these waters, maybe we just scale it back, we just deal with the petitioner, and then we can deal with the rest of this
I agree,
I
at a
agree,
different time.
I agree.
Don't make it really
Yep.
complicated.
That makes sense.
because, you know, I'm real uncomfortable with saying we're gonna treat the petitioner this way and everybody else on that same piece differently.
That makes
Why?
Right.
So,
Well, I think the option that land use, if I remember, is that we felt that we had to deal with the whole strip. Otherwise, if you divided it and you gave away, or dealt with part of it and not the rest, it would make an even less desirable remnant than what was already there.
for
So-
what though? Less desirable for opening the right of way, certainly, but it wouldn't be any less desirable to the adjacent property owners.
Well, if we had to
But it
potentially do
sounds
it.
like, it sounds, just for my clarification, the original petition wants to vacate the entire unopened right-of-way between their property and Phyllis' property
For the width of their property,
along their frontage.
yes.
Because they've encroached into the 50% that would be Bliss.
Correct.
So from their property to that fence is what we're vacating. And what we're talking about not vacating is what the committee brought forward, which is from the end of the property.
Correct.
Oh,
And again,
to
I
the
think
next
that was me just saying, hey, has no value, why don't we just take care of the whole thing, and in hindsight, should have gone down that.
Well,
As long as you. This may not make a lot of sense, but I think once we receive that petition, then it's clear what we have to follow. Right, and we not receive that petition and we just wanted to, on our own, vacate this with different rules of engagement.
Right, we can do something.
Exactly.
Yeah, Jay had a comment.
I know this sounds foolish, but just because we mentioned liability earlier in the evening, by hanging on to that remnant of property, if something would happen, would that make the city, you know, we didn't do something with it and we had a, I don't know,
Unless we were
landslide
aware
or
of
something, you know,
But we're not aware of it being.
we're not aware of it. I just was
Property
wondering.
owners are already fee simple owners of that property, there just happens to be an unopened right of way.
Right.
Vacating that opportunity for that right of way to be there, so.
There was a mudslide there behind the body works from the hill, and we had that same conversation at that time, that their property was saying, hey, you know, this is city property, and you're responsible. It's like, no, that's unopened right of way, you
Thanks for the clarification.
So
That
just-
helps.
So just for clarification as to what the petitioner is asking for, is the solid line that I drove through the 003-00 to the right is what they're requesting. So the little triangle piece is the petitioner, and then the half of the 003-00 to the right is half of the list property, and then the weird little arrow-looking triangle, that is also the list property. We have the property owners for both of those, and the petitioner themselves, so we have 100% of property owners approving the vacation as is. What the hope was, if they went all the way down, then we would have the, I believe it's Homemade Cafe, the other half of the list, and then Halls and Son. So we don't have Hall and Son, but needless to say, if the council wanted to move forward, I believe we have enough. Yeah, we have more
So
than.
00101 is Holland Sons.
Correct.
Yeah.
So at this point, if, when we bring it before you on December 10th, if you're comfortable just moving with what the petitioners requested, we have 100% of the property owners willing to vacate. So it's only gonna be affecting the Bliss property, their two properties, and then the petitioner. But upon council action, she'll have to correct the legal description to make sure it goes straight across, so it's not affecting her neighboring property.
So are you vacating the list half of the alley as well? And is the list paying for that?
That was gonna be my question. We've got something from Liz, from Dick, that says, I'm not opposing the vacation. Do we have anything that says, and I'm ready to write my check, or I'm not interested in paying
No.
for it,
And
or?
that's
there needs to
because
be another
the
blue
past
line.
practice,
The petitioner would pay for it.
yeah, she has to pay whatever the
100%.
value of the property is.
So she's paying for him, or she's only paying for her portion?
She's paying the whole.
She's paying
She's
his
paying the
half.
whole thing.
Yes.
But she doesn't get it.
But she
No.
only gets
He
half.
owns it. That's better yet.
Right. That's,
Who came up with these rules?
Yeah, the
yeah,
list
but
is
it's,
savvy.
we're not talking a lot of money.
No.
This
Yeah,
is-
but it's still the principle of the thing,
It
and
is. It
I'm
is.
gonna be responsible to buy my neighbor's property so that I can give it to him. And I don't even get to write it off on my taxes. What a heck of a thing.
Well, I think maybe the way you go about that then is you file both together as both being the petitioners and you.
Yeah, no,
Both by halves.
that's the logic, and it's assuming that the people on the other side are interested in
Well,
playing.
we should also look at it, she's more or less paying for the sins of,
Right.
well, of building into the right of way.
I was gonna say, in
Just
this case,
encroachment.
she needs to own that property.
I appreciate
So that's-
that, I'm just looking at the
Yeah,
sale of
no,
the
I
property and
understand.
following the process and the fairness of it, and it just doesn't seem,
Well, if you think about it, if I could add a little bit of a twisted, or a little bit of different way of looking at it, is that because the Bliss and she own the fee simple property,
right.
she's buying the lifting off of the easement, because she's the one who needs it to go away, so that she can move forward with the discussion with her neighbors. So the Bliss property, they don't get a whole lot of benefit from the easement being lifted. They get extra taxes on their property, so.
They have to maintain it now,
so
well, they
they're-
already maintain it anyways,
Right.
never mind.
But I mean, so there is some logic in having the petitioner, the person who really wants this property right lifted off the property.
I
to pay for
completely
it.
understand your logic and agree with it wholeheartedly, but the rules say, and we haven't gotten confirmation, or do we even care? Is Bliss gonna write the check, or is the petitioner gonna write the check and give it to Bliss? All we're dealing with is, we're gonna vacate it, and you guys fight it out, we don't wanna know about it, or do we have to say 50% of it goes to this property, and the other 50% goes to that, unless we hear differently, we're gonna expect them all to pony up.
Right, and that's where we don't have guidance either in the statute or in our own adopted policies about who pays. And to date, the practice has been whoever seeks the vacation pays, and I suppose they can reach out to their neighbors and say, hey, I paid all of this, I think it's fair that you, and so I don't know how much the city wants to get involved in. I mean, the city council can adopt a policy saying, we don't think the petitioner should have to pay it all, they should split it, so you could do that.
To me,
but-
I'm not, personally, I don't care who pays for it. I just wanna make sure that both property owners are agreeing as to how this transaction is going to occur. I don't want us to assume that the petitioner they're the one that's gonna benefit, so they get to pay for it all, and Phyllis comes up and say, wait a minute, who asked me? I want to buy 50%, I have a right to it.
But he's not buying anything.
Yeah, Sharon,
Yeah.
she made a statement that clarified it to me, and I think where we get hung up is the fact that, again, going back to Mark, it's an open right of way.
Right.
It's already owned by both property owners in fee simple. What the petitioner is paying for is not the property. They're paying for the right to remove
Our
the
right of
easement.
All right.
Right, so unfortunately, we're putting a dollar amount on that is associated with an appraisal.
Who's paying the taxes on that strip of ground today?
Nobody.
It's us, it's a
So
city.
who's gonna pay taxes on that strip of ground when we vacate this?
50%.
Yeah, 50,
That's my point.
Right.
Regardless of what it is, we're transferring ownership. And I,
Not-
I don't wanna be a
And I
big
We're not
horse here,
transferring
but
this will clarify.
transferring ownership might be a strong word, but we're transferring the rights to pay taxes on this property. And both sides should have a say in how this transaction's going to
Well,
be.
and when the
And
list signed the petition saying they were in support of it, that's our indication that they are in support
They're in
of taking.
support of our action,
Yeah,
but
so there-
does
And I
that
did have-
mean he wants that to pay taxes on 50% or not?
Correct, he knows that.
he knows that.
So when
Okay,
he
then I'm
called
shut
to say
up.
what
I
is
just
the,
made my point, so.
and just to, and I didn't mention this part of the conversation, and maybe this, I should have, and we wouldn't go down this path, but when I talked to, the adjacent property owners, in specifically the list, when he called and asked what the deal is, and I told him, that basically the petitioner pays for the legal description, they pay for the, value of the property, they have to get all the paperwork signed, they have to have a majority of the property owners or 2/3. And I said, what your role in is that you will obtain 50% of that, but you're also gonna get assessed additional property on your tax roll, so he is aware of that.
But what's gonna happen, so this is what's gonna
But-
happen. We're gonna approve this, it's gonna go vacated each side, so everybody, the easement rights removed. Now you've got a building that's sitting over on
Right,
the
that's
west
another
side.
issue.
Right.
At that point, they can claim adverse possession quiet title because it's been open and notorious for more than 10 years. And they'll be able to now get that property through quiet title action.
Beat you, that's their problem.
Right. What happens after it gets vacated?
Exactly.
That's not
That's
us.
their issue.
That's-
I don't care
It's a
about
civil
it.
matter of
Right.
an encroachment, but because the encroachment's been there for more than 10 years, you know, that's what's gonna happen.
And I can, have a conversation with him before this comes back before you on December 10th to make sure that he understands that he will be assessed additional property, taxes on this should the council move forward.
I think that was my question last week. Does everyone that's possibly impacted this fully understand what might happen?
I agree. I agree.
And I think that,
I agree.
Yes.
But you're including all the other parties in that.
I think we were
Well,
talking
we're
about
not-
not doing that.
We're not
Yeah,
gonna
and
do that.
Jay has a,
No, so I was gonna bring this back around, so I've gotten everybody's point about what's happening, but one thing I heard that we're only gonna vacate the portion that was requested, not the whole.
That's what I would
That's
suggest.
what I
Okay,
said.
that's what I said,
At this time.
okay, okay.
Yes.
Keep it simple.
Just keep it,
Cafe could come in and request
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
arrest.
Right.
yeah.
and then just for, my takeaway on this is to, for me to update the petition that the adjoining property owners, sign, that there is a section there that says, by signing this, you're understanding that you'll be assessed your tax roll. And then if the council chooses to say later that you also are gonna be obligated to pay 50% of whatever, that's a different issue. But in the meantime, I will make sure that the petitioner, that the adjacent property owners, when they sign that, it clearly states at a minimum that their, taxes will be assessed.
I would say
It's in
something that
writing.
you may be responsible for 50%, something like that, just so it's clear.
Just from a, I guess, a policy standpoint, with any of these changes today, because when we talked about this last week, it was everything. Does the public hearing we held last week still stand valid, or do we need to change, have another public hearing because something may have changed?
No, the public hearing was for the petitioner's petition part of it, so it's still good.
So as we move forward on the pathway project, so remember the Marley that's gonna fall under category one, where there's open right-of-way, where there's an encroachment, and we're gonna resolve that. They have to do the appraisal, they have to purchase. I think those are pretty straightforward.
Yep.
We'll have more of those coming forward. We'll also have some vacations coming forward, like Rose, some of these other ones, that where the unopened right-of-way is gonna have a lot more value than this, so the value conversation. So it's important that we get our process figured out
Yep.
as we get into these more value removal of that easement, right?
This discussion was very helpful. I think
Yes.
we all have a
Yes.
better understanding of
Mine is just really, the value is the value, and we calculate the value and get it appraised. It's, mine more is making sure that everybody all involved is aware of what's going on for them, so.
I need to make sure I understand. Future ones, let's not talk about this one, future ones, it's the petitioner is going to pay.
Unless there's no petition in the city, we could just take
Right.
action and decide that they.
Correct. Correct.
There would be no petitioner.
So, at first you have to determine what category it falls into. If we fall into the category in which then a petitioner wants to vacate, then it's going to be, are they just gonna ask him to vacate their half, which I believe they can.
Okay.
They don't have to, and we've done that.
Yeah,
So if they, in this particular case, if they just needed their half to clear their encroachment, this would have been easy peasy, but because they needed both halves to clear the encroachment, that's what created the adjacent from across having to give consent. So I think that's.
And the petitioner will pay as long as council requires them to pay. You don't have, they don't, yeah.
but to follow up on Beck's question, if I'm the petitioner and I want you to vacate this piece of ground and there are no encroachments, it's on open grass, I want you to vacate all the way up to the other property owners, and I'm willing to pay for it so that I can, do I get that right? Or do I only get the right to go up and ask for 50% of the width, using your 40-foot right-of-way, 20 goes to this side, 20 goes to that
I
side?
think they can do whatever they want with the petition, and as long as everybody's notified and has their.
It goes half and half. You'd have to do a
Yeah, I
BLA
think you do
or
more than 50.
a
Right,
deed.
no, they can, in their request, they would say, this is what we wanna do. Again, I'm going back to what we did in Tacoma.
But they can only go up to 50% of the width, they can't vacate 60% of that width.
No, but what I'm saying is, in their petition, what they did off Tacoma is they said, we need the
Yeah,
50%.
but let's just talk in general, not Tacoma, let's just
Right.
talk in general, you've got a 40-foot right-of-way. This property owner, do I have the ability here to say, I want you to vacate all the way up, all 40 feet?
Well,
No.
Again, I'm gonna
Otherwise,
use,
the petitioner would have done that.
I know, but that's why I wanna make sure that we're clear, it takes, I can only ask for up to 50%. It's that property over there that if they wanna participate, they
but
can
what
put
I'm
up
saying
their
is,
50%.
as
And
part
that's
of
where
the
farmers-
application,
Yes.
as part of the application, they could let us know that they've already talked to that property owner.
That's a different issue. I've got my neighbors to agree on this, if we're both coming forward,
Right.
and I have agreed
So
with my
then they
neighbor that
would
I'm gonna
both
pay
petition,
100% and
the
he's
other
giving
one
it
would
over.
petition for
Yes,
this.
that's what I'm saying. It would be a part of the application
Yeah.
process.
You only get 50%, and you have to have more than 2/3 of the adjacent property owners on board, otherwise you can't move it forward.
Well,
Which leads us into the next one.
yeah, the next one is gonna be a whole nother
We're out of
round.
it, and it's up to
Yeah,
them to go
it's-
resolve the rest of it civilly. That actually makes a lot of sense.
We
Okay.
Well, you put
put
encroachments
this on
in
the
it, does it
legislative
go all
agenda
the way
to
back?
clean up
Oh,
the
yeah.
statute.
Modified second part with a modified, motion.
But
But we'll have
Well,
the
the
same
motion-
motion.
Yes.
We may have to,
It'll be a yes, because the motion was as
but the
presented.
motion,
Yes.
we can vote no on the motion
But it seems like,
and make a new motion.
seems like we should put together a new
Yeah, it'll be a new
resolution or
chapter.
ordinance or something.
let's start with.
So
No, we
hopefully,
have a motion on the floor.
yes,
That we have to act on.
either vote.
That's for this
And
particular
we can
petition.
just vote
Yes.
no on it,
Yep.
and then we want to do it.
So hopefully this is a little bit.
Or amend one, or we can amend it.
Right.
But it would be nice to replace that 2014 practice and get a new resolution or something in place.
Yeah, actually. So this one here wants to vacate city right away. It's my understanding that from the indent of the existing fence, this piece here, over to here, if you do a straight line, is city right of way. So this gravel piece is city right of way. He wants to vacate it so he can actually park his car on his own property versus city right of way. He wanted to vacate all of this, but the problem is it becomes an issue because there's a power pole here, there's also, I think, a 4-inch main of some sort that is,
There's a orange
Right around
ductile
here
iron, but there's also an underlying Puget Sound easement.
yeah. So he was willing to adjust it to come just right before that easement of the PSE, which I believe comes right about here and over. But it's my understanding, and this right here is the city street.
Right, this is a,
There's no neighboring property owners, it's just the city road.
this is a strange area because this once was where Sydney crossed through before 16 blocked it, and then they went off of the Pottery extension. So it's a very large right-of-way. I guess if you go to page 203, you can kind of see that, well, that's not really showing it very well.
You want the map up too, Wade?
That there's just a lot of right of way out there. I guess, Brandy, the question I have is,
Right, so that's what he wants to vacate.
we've asked a number of times for him to provide an engineering, a surveyed drawing that depicts exactly what he's vacating and showing these existing easements, and I still don't see
Yeah,
this.
we haven't, this isn't, none of the information is asked for.
So it's
We
not
have
complete.
specifically,
Well, it's my
It's what we
understanding that
got.
we wanted to find out how much the council is wanting to vacate before he went and did all of the work.
but we can't, I would say, we can vacate whatever he needs, and it's not a big deal, but we need to know where things are.
I think the first question is there an interest in council in proceeding with a vacate here if he prepares, are we open to this, or?
This is an area that we clearly don't need for anything other than the easements and the water lines that we have in there.
Right.
From the public works perspective, we looked at it and we said, look, as long as you're addressing easements on top of utilities and that you have clearly depicted easements that have to do with Puget Sound Energy and Wave and everybody, as John said, it's not a big deal, but until you give us a plan that clearly shows where that pole and that riser and that phone pedestal are relative to what you want, then we can't go anywhere. And that's what we specifically asked for. Yeah, that's not,
That's his general.
that was a very generalized, we need a survey document.
So the direction is that the council will take a look at the documents once he provides a legal description and the petition and everything.
When it's complete,
We just talked about here a few minutes
Yeah.
ago, as
Right.
part of that, the petition, they have to have that.
must be complete.
Yeah, we'll support it.
I think he
You
can
know,
tell
we're-
that we are interested, and that he's gonna have to have those sunk costs anyways. So that once he's done with that, it might be a modification to what he prepares, but we have to see that it makes sense first, and it is a gamble.
But it's the same thing I told him at that meeting, I said, look, there's no opposition to this, we just need to see what it is in a
What
real
we can
new
give
scale.
up and what we can't.
Right, we need to make sure that
Not
everybody's,
clear, we get it out.
Yeah.
and I told him 3 times.
Try and make it clear.
I think I even gave him the name of some surveyors to go talk to.
You did, that's right.
So,
Now that we've addressed that, why would he wanna do this? I mean, are we charging him to park on our right of
No,
way?
it's just, he wants the.
Is there a setback issue that he wants to deal with? I don't know.
He wanted to also, I think, didn't he talk about a P patch or a community P patch, and he wanted.
well, he talked about the community P patch, I think he wants to extend a fence, but he wants to do it legally.
No, that's,
But again,
if he's doing the fence, I thought he just wanted to park on it.
That's
no,
what he
I think he wanted to do a
stated,
fence.
but.
He could have just,
He doesn't
we
want
would
to-
have never known.
Right, there's that, maybe that's what he's supposed to do.
I guess, whatever he wants, sounds.
I mean, I drive home, I go past last two fences that
Sure.
clearly are wide. And I'm wondering, where's the Mason County and Kitsap County on this? Because you've got the power pole on, inside, you know.
Inside the fence.
Yeah, it's like, how does that even happen? That's
Use your
typically,
power going to work on it.
well, why isn't the power company
And
on
then
it?
beware of
When they're
dog
driving
Yeah.
by on it? Why is our pole on the other side of that?
That's why they got the bucket truck, so they can reach over the fence.
Now, just for everybody's edification, the best thing to do is look up at a pole, look at the crossbar, and go to the extreme, and that's gonna get you close. If you're gonna do something without surveying, you can at least get fairly close by, you know, because those
So
crossbars.
that crossbar goes
I don't
out
know.
to the property
The
line.
crossbars
They
are,
did, they just went to the other cross.
Not at 429 Bay Street. That pole was on their
They
property.
would have to cut off
in
part of it.
general, Puget Sound is just very
The
good.
inside one, not the outside.
We're getting really close to adjourning, but I wanted to just, go back to our first discussion item this evening, and just make a couple comments on it. In that, the Parliamentary Bay Street Association, you know, are a great group of volunteers that do a lot of stuff. You know, they put up the lights, and they plant the flowers, and they've got an irrigation system up on our marquee also. And it became apparent with conversations that I had with Noah and with various volunteers, that I would like to see us in the next year work together to get an agreement or a memorandum of understanding, some sort of understanding document with them as to what they're doing, because they don't apply for any of this stuff. And we need to, I think, just have an understanding with them of what's gonna be the city's responsibility and what's gonna be their responsibility. And it doesn't have to be anything elaborate, but I do believe it should be in place.
Well, I guess to add to that, remember that we had, our current street use permit was an outcome of the request for outside bistro tables and outside merchandise. And then when we started talking to WashDOT, because we know that the right-of-way is from face of building to face of building, we went down this rabbit hole of what's the Marquee doing on our right-of-way? You don't have an airspace lease, you really need an airspace lease. And we really kind of avoided having to pay an airspace lease for the Marquee. So we have to just be very careful as we have those conversations about, you know, liability, who gets on top of the Marquee, who does what. You know, we really should be tying this, in my opinion, into that street use permit, some of these, so that we're kind of capturing that. And at some point, when we look at the, because we do have a preliminary Marquee removal relighting plan that we had PSC put together a few years ago. I've got a copy of it here, where we're gonna be looking at addressing how we're gonna light both sides of the street and provide cables to put banners back up and garland and all that. That's really the longer-term solution, is to
In
deal
the
with that.
meantime, at our last economic development meeting, which was a month ago, we always have the community, the chamber is there, and POB is there, POBSA is there, it's another, you know, merchants are there. And at that time, POB let us know that they had the Boo Bash the next week, which we did not know because it wasn't anything they needed a permit for. But they also let us know at that time that the irrigation system, which we own, which they own, is on top of our Marquee, and that it is not functioning properly, and they're looking to replace it. So now we're going to have them putting a major asset on our asset again. So I just feel that we need, at least we should talk about, spell out, you know, whose responsibilities are what. And, you know, I think we could have avoided some things this time if we had thought about going down and checking the electrical. I mean, it worked fine last year, it just didn't work fine this year, you know, so.
Well, again, there's issues with the electrical, and when Myries burned down, we just literally had it powered over the top of the building, and the wires burned up, so we had to run power from Frederick. It's, you know, to me, the bigger issues are, we found no agreements that said we could actually connect the marquee to those buildings, but they're physically connected. We've got the marquee that's held up by poles, but the poles are holding up the marquee. We found out when Rings and Things developed, and he took that one pole down, or he took the marquee down, the pole was rotten. So the wooden poles are really a liability. The interspersed steel poles are there holding the marquee that are actually holding up the wooden poles. So the reason I'm bringing this up is if we start looking at putting improvements, electrical or anything to that marquee, everybody needs to understand that that's a short-term thing, because at any moment, the marquee could go away, or we could be forced to take the marquee down. And so we don't want to get in a situation where they say, well, like we did with the lights for Van Zee, where there was a pay down. Like, okay, we're gonna put $10,000 investment into this, but if it doesn't go a full 10 years, you owe us money back. I mean, we don't wanna go there. It's like, you put this up at your own risk, and you still can't get up on top, because there's that liability.
Right, so I'm just, what I'm
I agree
saying
with you,
is,
Beck, we need to get it, everybody on the same page, just get it.
right, we've been doing this real informally for a long time, and it's worked really well, but not now. I mean, going forward, we should just
Well,
put
if nothing
something
else,
together.
it just clarifies the understandings, who's doing what, how, and where.
Times have changed. Yes, that too.
Once it's vacated,
Is there anything else that we need to discuss this evening?
All of the
quickly we
trees
can adjourn.
sold, everyone, even the ones that had no power, which all of them basically have now. But, yes, all the
She wanted
trees.
3 and there's only 1 left.
You guys, we sold
last
every
person bought the
single
last
one. Isn't that just too cool? And we're gonna double next year.
double the price or double the number of trees.
The number of trees.
We need more outlets.
Just teasing.
Yeah, we already